Death of a Village Healer. Hamish Macbeth Mystery. A gentle rain falls over Lochdubh as word spreads that the village healer, Morag Kinloch, has been found lifeless in her cottage. No struggle, no sound, only unsettling stillness. Hamish Macbeth arrives quietly, aware that in a place where whispers travel faster than wind, someone already knows more than they should. Good evening and welcome, dear listeners. Welcome to tonight's mystery. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you relaxing at home, on the go, or somewhere a bit unexpected? Share your answer in the comments. I always enjoy hearing from our wonderful community. And do not forget to like and subscribe me for more mysteries every day. Now, let's get cozy and dive into tonight's story. Chapter 1. The Quiet Shock in Lochdubh. Morning drifted gently over the Highlands as Hamish Macbeth walked the familiar road toward Lochdubh, letting the pale light settle around him like a soft shawl. Wisps of mist clung to the heather, shifting with each quiet breath of wind. The village lay ahead, hushed and waiting, as though reluctant to disturb the fragile calm resting upon the waking day. Hamish moved at an easy pace, boots brushing lightly against the damp earth. A faint coolness lingered in the air, carrying the scent of wet stone and distant pines. He enjoyed these early hours when nothing pressed upon him. Yet as he neared the cottages, he sensed that this morning's quietness held a weight not born from simple calm today. Small groups of villagers stood near garden walls and gateposts, their conversations barely more than murmurs. Though they greeted Hamish with familiar nods, their eyes held a guarded softness, as if each carried a thought they were reluctant to name. The air between them felt unusually delicate, stretched thin by something unsettled, yet still wrapped in the village's customary politeness. It was Mrs. Carmichael who stepped toward him at last, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders as though the mild morning chill had deepened. She spoke his name gently, then paused, searching for words that would not disturb the air too sharply. When she finally told him about Morag Kinloch, her voice wavered with quiet disbelief rather than fear. News of Morag's death settled over the village like a dim shadow. She had long been a steady presence, offering herbs and quiet reassurance to anyone who sought her door. Hamish listened without interrupting, giving Mrs. Carmichael room to speak. Around them, villagers' voices softened, as though lowering their tone might honor the gentleness they had always associated with her. After thanking her softly, Hamish made his way along the winding lane that led toward the edge of the village. The cottages grew fewer here, giving way to open stretches of grass touched with dew. Drizzle drifted in the air, carrying the scent of peat smoke from a distant hearth, a scent that reminded him of quiet Highland mornings today. Morag's cottage came into view beyond a gentle rise where the land met a scatter of pines. Its stone walls, usually brightened by herbs at the windows, looked subdued in the muted light. Hamish paused at the foot of the path, taking in the stillness surrounding the place, sensing that whatever waited inside would soon be clear to him today. He walked slowly toward the cottage door, noticing how the grass along the path lay flattened by the night's dampness. A robin perched on the nearby fence, its small presence steady in the quiet. The morning drizzle eased, leaving the air washed clean. Hamish felt the familiar pull of responsibility settle around him, guiding his steps with patient certainty today. As he reached the doorstep, he rested his hand lightly against the cool stone wall, taking a steadying breath. The cottage felt different now, as though holding its silence more tightly than before. Hamish knew that whatever he found inside would shape the rest of the day, yet he approached without haste, letting the calm around him guide his thoughts. Before stepping inside, he allowed himself a final moment to absorb the quiet that lay over the hills and rooftops. The stillness felt almost protective, as if the landscape wished to offer a gentle pause before the day's truths unfolded. He listened to the soft drip of water from the eaves, the distant call of a gull, and the faint rustle of wind across the pines. Then, with calm resolve, he reached for the door, ready to face whatever waited beyond it for him there. Hamish paused at the low stone wall that bordered Morag Kinloch's narrow garden path, letting the soft drizzle bead across his hair and shoulders before he stepped farther. The morning had grown heavier since he first wandered into the village. Clouds now pressed lower, dimming the gentle colors of Lochdubh until everything appeared washed in a muted watercolor hush. It was the kind of rain that didn't demand attention, only settled in quietly, the way people here often did when something troubled them. He spotted Mrs. Effie McCrae standing beneath the eaves of her cottage next door, her hands wrapped around a damp shawl pulled tight over her chest. Effie was usually brisk and bright, always ready with a comment about the weather or a neighbor's gardening choices, but today she seemed smaller somehow, as if the drizzle had soaked into her very posture. Hamish approached slowly. "Effie," he said, giving her a soft nod, "I heard you were the one who feigned her." She blinked, without lifting her head fully, her gaze sliding somewhere past his shoulder rather than landing on him. I was," she murmured. "Terrible thing, of course. Poor Morag." Her tone held no tremor, just a practiced steadiness. Hamish noted it the way he noted everything, the slow and the subtle, the edges most folk overlooked. "Can you tell me what you saw?" he asked gently. Effie pressed her lips together, considering. "Well, I'd gone over early. She hadn't come by yesterday evening for our usual cup of tea. I thought she might have been feeling poorly. You know how she was always forgetting to mind her own health while tending everyone else's." She gave a small, brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. Hamish watched her carefully. "And when you went in?" Effie looked toward the cottage, toward the small window with its fading curtains. It was quiet, strangely quiet. No kettle on, no embers glowing in the grate, just her, sitting in her chair, head turned as if she'd fallen asleep reading. Peaceful, almost. Too peaceful, if I'm honest. That caught his attention. Too peaceful? I hesitated. Morag was always moving, always fussin' with something. Her herbs, her fire, her notes, her blasted old radio. Seeing her so still, it didn't feel right. It didn't look like pain took her, not like a bad heart or a fall. She just stopped. Hamish let the silence settle. Lochdubh's drizzle filled it easily, pattering against the eaves, tapping on the windowsill beside them. "You mentioned she'd been feeling off lately," he asked. Effie stiffened, just faintly. "Did I?" "Aye, earlier." No, just tired. We're all tired this time of year. The nights are too long, that's all." Another practiced deflection, a small one, but clear. Hamish didn't press. Not yet. Effie's gaze kept slipping away from his, always drifting toward the loch, toward the narrow lane, anywhere but his face when Morag's final days came up. There was something she didn't want to say, or something she feared saying. He tried a different angle. "And the others? Have they been by?" "A few." Effie shrugged without looking toward the road. "Fiona came, then Alec Campbell. Both paid their respects and went on their way. No fuss." That's what puzzled him. No fuss. For a woman so well liked, so interwoven into the rhythms of village life, the response felt oddly muted. Not cold, exactly. Lochdubh was too tightly knit for that, but restrained, contained, as if everyone had quietly decided that gentle silence was the most appropriate reaction, or perhaps the safest. "Did Morag mention anything unusual to you these past days? Visitors, trouble, worries of any kind?" he asked softly. Effie's fingers tightened on the shawl. "Nothing worth repeating." She said it too quickly, the words skimming over their own meaning. "I see," he murmured. "Thank you, Effie. You've done right by checking on her." She gave him a small nod and stepped back toward her door. For a fleeting second, her eyes met his fully, and something flickered there. Not fear, but a hint of resignation, as if she'd expected this moment, expected the questions, expected the quiet unraveling of something larger than she wished to speak of. Hamish turned toward Morag's cottage.
From the outside it looked ordinary, a tidy stone structure, moss creeping along the roofline, window boxes still brimming with the hardy winter herbs she'd tended with stubborn devotion. Nothing about it suggested tragedy or alarm. Nothing about it cried out for attention. It was, in fact, too orderly. The path was swept, the door closed gently. No sign of disturbance in the flower beds, no hurried footprints in the soft soil, no forgotten tools leaning where they shouldn't be. As if she'd simply walked in one last time, placed her things exactly where she always did, and then sat down to rest. The drizzle deepened into a fine mist. Hamish inhaled the scent of wet peat, heather, and faint wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys. Peaceful scents, familiar ones, and yet the air felt charged in a way he couldn't explain, like a quiet room where something important had been removed, leaving a hollow space nobody mentioned. He reached for the latch. Behind him, a door creaked open. Effie stepped halfway out again, her voice barely above the whisper of rain. "Hamish?" He paused and glanced over. "You'll go gently, won't you?" she asked, twisting the shawl. "She deserves gentle." "Aye," he said, his voice steady. "I always do." She nodded once and retreated, closing the door with the softest click. Hamish turned back to Morag's cottage. A death without alarm, he thought. A scene too calm, reactions too quiet, and beneath it all, something unspoken threading through the still morning, waiting for him inside. He reached for the latch.
Chapter 2. Morag's Cottage of Secrets. Hamish eased the door inward with the care one might use when entering a room where someone still slept. It swung with barely a sound, just a faint sigh of wood against wood, as though protesting the disturbance of its own gentle stillness. He paused on the threshold, noting how the latch hadn't been fully engaged, not broken, not forced, simply resting, as if the last person to touch it intended to return in a moment, or meant to reassure a familiar visitor that they were welcome. The air inside held Morag's unmistakable signature, dried lavender and crushed juniper, softened by the faintest trace of peat smoke absorbed into the old beams. It was a comforting scent, warm and familiar, the sort that made people breathe easier just by stepping through her door. Yet this morning, it carried something else beneath it, a thin, metallic note, quiet but persistent, like a single thread out of harmony in an otherwise pleasant melody. Hamish stepped inside. The small entryway gave way to Morag's main living space, and everything, from the braided rug to the tidy shelves, looked as though it had been arranged with thoughtful care. A soft woolen shawl hung neatly on its hook. Her boots stood side by side near the hearth, the leather gently oiled. A teacup and saucer had been washed and set upside down to dry near the sink, not a water droplet out of place. He took his time scanning each detail. A tidy home wasn't unusual for Morag. She believed a cluttered space muddied the mind. But tidy on a day she died? Tidy to the point of stillness? There was something in the precision that didn't sit comfortably. Not wrong, exactly, just too deliberate. A tiny table near the window drew his eye. On it lay an unfinished herbal mixture, a small ceramic bowl, a wooden pestle, and 3 neatly separated piles of dried plants. Rosemary sprigs, crushed rowan berries, a pinch of dried nettle, each measured with meticulous care. But the 4th space on the table, a clean circle where another ingredient should have been, lay empty. Hamish leaned closer. Morag had taught half the village about herbs, formally or informally. He knew enough to identify what she'd begun mixing, something restorative, mild, perhaps intended for sleep or easing the mind. But something was missing, a key component she always used to complete the blend. He could picture the color of it, but not the plant itself. An odd lapse of memory for him, yet it pushed the edge of recognition. He frowned softly. Most healers left signs of their work, little imperfections, a pinch spilled here, a stem fallen there. But Morag's workspace was spotless. Had she been preparing something for a visitor, for herself,
for someone she trusted enough to relax her usual caution. He let the question settle as he moved further inside. The bed in the adjoining room was perfectly made, the woolen blankets smoothed flat, pillows fluffed as if waiting for the evening. No books left open on the bedside table, no shawl tossed across the quilt, just order, unbroken and absolute. Hamish stepped lightly, absorbing the quiet with each breath. "Too peaceful," he murmured under his breath, echoing Effie's earlier words. But here, within these walls, the peacefulness felt almost staged. It had the quality of a room prepared for company, a scene set with deliberate intention. He walked back toward the main room and paused at the doorframe, running a finger gently along its edge. No marks, no scratches, no signs of someone pushing too hard or entering in a hurry. Whoever came last was welcome, or had no need to force anything. He glanced back at the door, still slightly ajar behind him. It wasn't the kind of mistake Morag made absent-mindedly. She was vigilant, every habit shaped by years of working alone and tending to people's ailments often late into the night. If she left it open even a fraction, it was because she expected someone to follow, someone she didn't fear. Hamish moved to the hearth, where the ashes lay cool. The fire had been out for several hours, perhaps since the late evening. A single twig of heather sat at the edge of the soot, placed there with intention, a cleansing ritual, he realized. Morag often laid heather in the grate when preparing for difficult conversations. Her scent soothed nerves and settled worry. She must have anticipated something requiring steadiness. Or someone. His gaze drifted again to the missing herb. That empty circle on the table seemed louder the longer he looked at it. Not an accident, not a forgotten step, something she hadn't gotten around to adding, or something she never meant to complete before her visitor arrived. He circled the room once more, absorbing the textures and tones of Morag's life, the ribbons hanging from the mantel, the neat row of jars each labeled in a looping hand, the small knitted poof beside the armchair she'd been found in, all familiar elements. Yet together they created an atmosphere that felt strangely suspended, as though time itself had paused the moment her visitor stepped through the open door. Hamish approached the chair, stopping just short of touching it. Its cushions are indented, shaped by years of her settling into it after long days. But today it held no warmth, only memory. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet speak. No struggle, no mess, no sign of panic, but also no sign of surprise. When he opened his eyes again, they fell on the door once more, just the slightest gap between wood and frame, enough to welcome, enough to signal a comfort with whoever last crossed her threshold. Hamish exhaled slowly. Morag had expected someone. She had prepared for them. She had left her door unlatched. And yet, whatever passed between them left her in that chair, her home in perfect order, her herbal work incomplete, and her visitor gone without a trace of haste. He stepped back toward the table with the unfinished mixture, the silence thickening around him. The missing ingredient nagged at him, like a forgotten word on the tip of his tongue. But more troubling was the impression that someone else already knew what it was, and why it mattered. Hamish touched the edge of the empty circle lightly. "Who were you waiting for, Morag?" he whispered. The cottage offered no answer, only the soft, lingering scent of herbs and a faint, open doorway that seemed to breathe with secrets.
Hamish lingered near the small table before letting his eyes drift slowly across the room again, allowing the cottage to speak in its own quiet language. The order remained impressive at first glance, yet the longer he looked, the more he sensed faint ripples beneath the surface, tiny disturbances that seemed to whisper of another presence, someone who moved through the space with care, but not with Morag's rhythm. He stepped toward the sitting area, and that was when he noticed the chair nearest the hearth. It was only a few inches out of place, angled slightly toward the door rather than facing the fire as it usually did. Morag never angled chairs without reason. She disliked imbalance in a room. She believed chairs facing the fire kept the warmth flowing, as she put it.
But this one had been moved just enough to catch Hamish's attention, as though someone had stood from it hastily or shifted it to make quiet room for a conversation that never resumed. He crouched beside it, running a hand along the wool seat cushion. No indentation remained, too much time had passed, but the change in alignment felt deliberate, not accidental, a small detail, but his mind tucked it away. As he rose, his gaze returned to the door where Morag's boots rested in their usual place. But when he looked closer, he saw that the leather was darker around the toes and soles, with a faint sheen clinging to the edges. Damp, not soaked, but unmistakably touched by recent moisture. He pressed a knuckle against one boot lightly. The coolness confirmed it. Yet no rain had fallen during the night. The ground outside that morning had been firm beneath his feet, the grass damp only with the usual dew. If Morag had been outside recently, it would have been before dusk the evening prior, and the boots should have dried by now. Either she had been out far later than anyone realized, or someone else had worn them, placing them back carefully, but not carefully enough to catch Hamish's attention. He felt a soft shift inside his chest, a quiet awareness settling in like a feather drifting to the floor. Something didn't match. He moved further into the cottage, noticing a small dresser near the side wall. One drawer sat slightly ajar, half an inch perhaps, but in Morag's tidy world, that half inch carried meaning. He brushed 2 fingers against its edge and gently nudged it open. Inside lay neatly folded scarves, their patterns bright with Highland colors. Nothing appeared disturbed, nothing missing as far as he could tell, but someone had opened this drawer recently, someone who either didn't know Morag's habits or didn't care to hide that they had searched through her belongings. He closed it with the same soft care he imagined Morag would have used, letting it slide shut with a faint click. Taking a slow breath, he walked toward the shelves above the work table where Morag kept her herbs. Jars lined the wooden planks with careful spacing, each labeled in her flowing script, but when he looked at the top shelf, he noticed a blank space between 2 jars where another should have stood. A clean circle of dust outlined its absence, leaving no doubt that it had been removed recently. Hamish traced the empty spot with a fingertip. The missing jar had been of average size, nothing unusual in shape or height. But Morag didn't misplace her herbs. She knew each one intimately, storing them by season, potency, and purpose. If a jar was gone, someone had taken it intentionally. The question pressed in, why this one? He let his eyes sweep the remaining labels, trying to recall which herb belonged there. His memory placed something light, something with pale leaves and a sharp scent when crushed, something not commonly used except for particular remedies, ones that not everyone would know how to handle, but the exact plant eluded him, like a word hovering just beyond thought. He stepped back to take in the entire room again. At a glance, everything was still orderly, peaceful, calm, but now the inconsistencies stood out, like threads of a different color woven into a familiar pattern. The subtly moved chair, the damp boots, the half-open drawer, the missing jar, each alone could be dismissed. Together, they formed a quiet but undeniable suggestion of disruption. Hamish moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. The cottage felt different now, as though its silence hid more than the gentle memories of its owner. The tidy order did not soothe him as it once might. Instead, it felt like a surface polished to conceal what lay beneath. He stepped outside into the Highland air. The soft drizzle had eased, leaving the scent of wet earth drifting around him. Behind him, Morag's cottage stood still and composed, the open door resting exactly where he had found it. Hamish exhaled slowly. Morag had been preparing for something she intended to finish, something she never got the chance to complete. And someone else had been there with her, moving through the cottage with quiet purpose. Whatever she had been expecting, she did not expect danger. Hamish closed the door gently behind him, carrying the weight of that thought with him as he walked down the path.
Chapter 3.
Whispers around the village. Hamish pushed open the door to the bakery, letting the warmth wash over him in a gentle wave. The air carried the comforting scent of fresh bread, honeyed scones, and the faint crackle of the morning fire. Flour dust floated in the sunlight like drifting snowflakes, settling on the wooden counters and giving the shop a soft, homely glow. Mrs. McLean stood behind the counter, shaping dough with calm, steady movements. Her sleeves were rolled up, her cheeks rosy from the heat of the oven, and her familiar hum filled the quiet space. When she looked up and saw Hamish, her smile spread easily at first. "Mornin', Hamish," she said, voice warm as a fresh loaf. "You're out early today." "Morning, Mrs. McLean," Hamish replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. A few villagers lingered at small tables, sipping tea and tearing pieces from warm rolls. Their conversations were soft and scattered, but as Hamish crossed the room, the murmur dipped, almost imperceptibly, like a breeze flattening for a heartbeat. He approached the counter, removing his cap in a small gesture of respect. "I've come from Morag's cottage. I'm afraid there's been news." The dough beneath Mrs. McLean's hands stilled. Her fingers tightened, then relaxed just as quickly, but the brief pause hung in the air with unmistakable weight. Her smile faltered, though she tried to recover it. "Ah," she said, almost breathless. "So it's true, then." Hamish gave a soft nod. I'm trying to gather a sense of her last few days. You saw her recently." Mrs. McLean swallowed, her gaze shifting to the side before returning to him. "As I do most days. She came by yesterday for a loaf and a bit of company. She always said the warmth of the bakery kept her bones from creaking." "And how was she?" Hamish asked gently, keeping his tone light as though asking casually about the weather. There it was again, that momentary hesitation, a flicker of something that passed through her expression like a shadow across sunlit flour. She was herself," she began, then stopped. She pressed her lips together, dusting her hands clean. "Though maybe a little quieter than usual." Hamish tilted his head slightly. "Quieter in what way?" "Oh, you know how folk get when the seasons change," she said quickly, almost too quickly. "The dive evenings settlin' in early, the cold crip and under doors, makes us all a bit thoughtful." Behind Hamish he heard the faint clatter of a spoon as someone set down their cup with more force than intended. A pair of villagers had paused mid-bite, eyes lowered, but ears pointed unmistakably in his direction. "But Morag wasn't one to brood," Mrs. McLean added, softer this time. "She always said there was no sense wasting energy on things you couldn't mend." Hamish studied her face. She wouldn't meet his eyes now, choosing instead to rearrange a tray of buns that didn't need rearranging. "You mentioned she was quieter, said something bothering her." Mrs. McLean's hands paused again, another small, telling moment. She let out a breath through her nose, shaking her hands clean. "It's not my place to say. I understand," Hamish replied. He kept his voice warm, steady. "I'm only trying to make sense of what happened." She looked up at him then, eyes soft with worry, but edged with something heavier, regret perhaps, or unease. She seemed troubled, that's all, as if she had something on her mind. But when I asked, she brushed it off, said it was nothing worth stirring the pot over. Hamish nodded slowly. "Did she mention seeing anyone recently? Anyone out of the ordinary?" Mrs. McLean massaged the edge of the counter with her thumb. "Folk visit her all the time, Hamish, you know that. Half the village owes her a favour, and the other half owes her a secret." She attempted a small smile, but it didn't quite hold. "But if she did have a visitor yesterday, she didn't speak of it." From the tables behind him came the faint rustle of shifting chairs. Hamish didn't turn, but he could feel the attention gathering like mist against the back of his neck, quiet, careful, pretending not to look. "She cared about this village," Mrs. McLean murmured, "and we cared for her. If something weighed on her, I'm sure she meant to sort it out herself." Hamish let the silence sit for a moment, gentle and unrushed. "If anything comes to mind later," he said, "no matter how small, would you let me know?"
Mrs. McLean nodded, though her eyes drifted again toward the window, avoiding his gaze. "Aye, of course." As Hamish stepped back, offering her a grateful nod, he felt the room stir subtly behind him. Conversations resumed, but with a different cadence, lighter on the surface, heavier beneath. Eyes followed him for a moment longer than needed. Mrs. McLean watched him go, her hands folded together, her breath shallow. Outside, the cool air brushed against his face, clearing the warmth of the bakery from his senses. He walked a few paces down the lane before glancing back through the window. Mrs. McLean stood exactly where he'd left her, staring at nothing, as though the weight of her unspoken words settled around her like flour on the floor. Hamish continued on, the quiet hesitations of the village slipping into his thoughts like breadcrumbs marking an unseen path.
Hamish stepped into the Lochside Inn, welcoming the familiar blend of wood smoke, warm peat, and the faint aroma of last night's stew lingering in the air. The lamps cast a golden glow across the low ceiling, and the murmur of conversation wrapped around the room like a knitted shawl. This was where the village settled into itself, where stories were shared freely, and the rhythm of Lochdubh's heart could be felt most clearly. A few regulars sat near the windows overlooking the loch, their mugs half raised in greeting as Hamish approached. Old Dougal, with his weathered cap and beard like wind-blown thistle, motioned him over. "Hamish, lad," he said, voice gentle. "Come, take a seat. Heard a whisper you were asking after Morag." Hamish slid onto the wooden bench beside them, setting his cap on the table. "Aye," he replied softly. "Just trying to understand how she'd been lately." At once, the table fell quiet, not tense, but careful. Hamish could almost hear the thoughts rearranging themselves behind their eyes. "She was fine," said Annie Grant, the innkeeper's niece, her tone brisk but kind. "Still tending her herbs, still stopping by for tea, strong as ever." She nodded with such certainty that her earrings swayed. "If anything was wrong, none of us saw it." "Aye, well," Dougal countered, scratching his chin, "I'd not say she was quite herself. She looked tired, worn round the edges, like she'd been wakened too early or sleeping too late." Annie frowned at him. "That's not true. She looked perfectly well last week when she came in for oatcakes." "Last week," Dougal said pointedly, "wasn't yesterday." Hamish let the exchange settle before speaking. "Did either of you notice anything unusual? Anything she said or did that felt out of character?" A man at the next table leaned over. Angus McCrae, a quiet fisherman with a voice softened by years of calling over waves. "Only thing unusual," he murmured, "was seeing her by the loch the other night." Annie blinked. Morag? By the loch? She hated the damp air there. Angus shrugged, lifting his mug. "Well, I saw her. Tall figure, shawl pulled up, moving slow along the water's edge. It was her. I'd bet my nets on it." "That makes no sense," Annie insisted. "She said walking there chilled her bones." "Folk do things we don't expect," Dougal said gently, "especially when they're troubled." Hamish watched their faces, Annie's tight with disbelief, Angus's steady, Dougal's uncertain in a quiet, thoughtful way. Their memories didn't clash harshly. They overlapped like thin glazes of paint, each adding a slightly different tint to a picture that refused to sharpen. "Did you speak to her?" Hamish asked Angus. "No," Angus replied. "She was too far down the shore, and, well, she seemed deep in her thoughts. I didn't want to disturb her." Annie shook her head. "I still say you saw someone else. Maybe Mary from the croft. She's forever taking moonlit walks." Angus chuckled softly. "Mary doesn't wear shells." Hamish leaned back slightly, letting the contradicting accounts settle. A warm breeze drifted through the slightly opened window, carrying the distant sound of the loch's gentle lapping. Conversations in the room had shifted now, certain ears tuning in, certain eyes flicking toward him. Everyone meant well, he could feel that, but well-meaning folk sometimes protected truths without realizing it. What about her general mood?
Hamish asked quietly. Withdrawn, chatty, anything stand out? She was cheerful as ever, Annie said firmly. Not cheerful, Dougal murmured. More polite than cheerful, like she was keepin' something tucked away. Angus nodded. Aye, and she didn't linger. Usually she'd stay a while, ask after folks' aches and pains. But last time I saw her here, she left quick, almost like she had an appointment. Annie opened her mouth to counter, then hesitated, just for a moment. Well, maybe she was tired. Hamish noted the hesitation, small but there. He rose slowly, offering them a grateful nod. Thank you, all of you. If anything else comes to mind, no matter how small, please let me know. They murmured their agreement, and as Hamish stepped away from the table, he felt their gazes linger, each of them quietly sorting through memories, perhaps questioning what they had seen or what they had chosen not to see. Outside the air was crisp, carrying the scent of water and pine. Hamish walked toward the loch, the overlapping stories weaving themselves through his thoughts. Contradictions gentle yet persistent, like ripples on the water that refused to reveal their source. Nothing aligned yet, but something lay beneath these softened threads. Something waiting.
Chapter 4. The Healer's Last Days. Hamish set out early the next morning, the air still touched with a pale silver mist rising from the loch. The village stirred slowly, shutters opening, quiet footsteps marking the start of another modest day. But beneath that everyday calm, Hamish carried the growing sense that Morag's final hours had been threaded with intentions no one yet fully understood. He began at the bakery. Mrs. McLean greeted him with her usual warmth, though her smile seemed pulled tighter than usual. The scent of fresh oatcakes and honeyed rolls swirled through the small shop, lingering in the rafters like a comforting fog. Hamish stepped lightly around the baskets of warm loaves as Mrs. McLean recounted Morag's last visit. Aye, she came in early the morning before, she said, her voice soft in the way someone speaks of good memories. Asked for her usual, 2 small loaves, slightly underbaked. You know how she liked them. Mrs. McLean's brow furrowed briefly. But she wasn't fully present. I had to repeat myself once or twice. She kept glancing at the door, as if expecting something or someone to arrive behind her. Hamish listened without interrupting. That same thread, anticipation mixed with unease, had begun appearing in every recollection of Morag's final days. From the bakery, he walked toward the small market where Morag regularly purchased her herbs. Mrs. Dalrymple, who tended the herb stall, was sorting bundles of dried lavender when Hamish approached. She lowered her hands slowly, brushing stray petals from her apron. Morag was here only 3 days ago, she said, before Hamish even asked. Bought a handful of comfrey, some elderflower, and the usual valerian. Nothing strange about the herbs themselves. She paused, her eyes drifting toward the northern hills as though replaying the moment. But she hesitated, looked at the rarer jars several times, the ones she hasn't touched in years. I even asked if she needed something stronger for a patient, but she said no, though she didn't sound certain of her own answer. Hamish felt the soft shift in the air, a pattern forming, but not yet settling into shape. Next he stopped by the post office, where Mr. Corbett was arranging parcels with the deliberate slowness of a man who believed haste led only to mistakes. At the mention of Morag, the old postmaster sighed, his shoulders dipping gently. He said, She came in just before closing, not in any rush, but distracted, looked as though her thoughts were 3 steps ahead of her words. He shuffled through a small ledger, stopping at a thin envelope. She posted 1 letter, no return address, nothing written in her usual hand either. Seemed more cautious, you might say. Strange for Morag. She wasn't one to hide her intentions. Hamish leaned closer. And the parcel she ordered? The special herbs?
Mr. Corvett nodded slowly. Aye, those. Ordered a week before her death. Rare mix, very rare. Haven't seen her ask for such things since... His sentence trailed off into a silence he didn't bother to explain. They didn't arrive in time. Still sitting in Inverness, last I heard. Hamish thanked him, though the gesture felt hollow against the weight settling on his thoughts. Morag's days had been woven from ordinary errands, bread, herbs, a letter, and yet there was a faint trembling at the edges of every account, something she hadn't voiced, something she may have hoped to resolve before it reached her doorstep. As Hamish walked back through the village, small details resurfaced, Morag pausing mid-sentence at the bakery, her long glances at rare herbs, the careful anonymity of her letter. Each act seemed quiet enough, gentle enough, but stitched together they formed the outline of an unfinished intention. Nothing about her last days spoke of panic. Instead, it was the silence between her actions that unsettled him, a silence filled with expectation, as though Morag had been waiting for something she knew was coming, but not whether it would bring comfort or harm. And whatever she'd been preparing for, she didn't live long enough to finish.
Hamish found Ailey McCrae sitting on the low stone wall behind the kirk, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched the wind move through the heather fields. The sky was a muted grey, the sort that softened the world rather than dimming it. Ailey had been one of Morag's closest friends, quiet herself, steady, dependable. When Hamish approached, she offered a small nod, as though she had been expecting him. "I suppose you've come to ask about Morag," she said, her voice almost carried off by the breeze. Hamish took a seat on the wall beside her, allowing a few moments of silence to pass before speaking. "Aye, just trying to understand the shape of her last days. Anything you can share helps." Ailey hummed thoughtfully, eyes narrowing slightly as she surveyed the distant hills. "Morag lived a life few understood. Even those of us who loved her couldn't always tell what weighed on her heart but loneliness. That was the companion she carried the longest." Hamish listened carefully, letting her words settle. "You know about her sister?" Ailey continued. "Most folk forget it's been nearly 20 years since she passed. They were close, inseparable really. Losing her changed Morag. She still healed the village, still tended to everyone else's aches and ailments, but she tucked away her own grief." Ailey pressed her hands together more tightly. "She always felt things deeply, perhaps too deeply." The wind stirred again, brushing strands of hair across her face. She didn't move them aside. "In these last months," Ailey said, "I saw a different kind of quiet in her. Not the peaceful sort she'd always carried, but a heavier stillness. She stopped coming to the knitting circle, stopped joining the evenings at the inn, even missed Mary's birthday tea, and she never missed those things." Ailey's gaze fell to the ground. "When I asked, she'd smile, say she was just tired, but her eyes, they told another story." Hamish's mind returned to the tidy cottage, the open door, the unfinished herbs. A pattern of careful restraint now mirrored in Ailey's recollection. "Did she ever speak of fears or concerns you found unusual?" Ailey hesitated, just long enough for Hamish to sense she had been holding something close. "There was one thing," she admitted quietly. "A few weeks ago, we sat by her fire. She'd made tea, chamomile and mint, her blend. We talked about nothing and everything, and then she fell silent, staring into the flames. She said she'd been having troubling thoughts, shadows of things she couldn't quite name." Hamish leaned slightly forward. "Did she say more?" "No," she Ailey shook her head, her voice thinning. "And I didn't push her. I should have, perhaps. She just said she felt as though something from her past had begun circling back. Not a person exactly, more like a weight she'd once managed to set down." Ailey paused. "She said it felt inevitable,
Whatever it was, a faint chill touched the air around them. Eily wrapped her arms lightly around herself, though the breeze was mild. There were nights, she continued. She told me she stayed awake until dawn. Not out of fear, she claimed, just unease. She would sit by the window, listening to the wind, or walk through her garden in the dark. I think she was searching for something she couldn't identify, or maybe she already knew, but couldn't bring herself to say. Hamish let out a quiet breath. Do you think she believed something was coming? Eily's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the ache of old affection. Yes, she whispered. I think she knew, and I think she believed she couldn't stop it. The soft sadness in her voice settled into Hamish's thoughts, like mist gathering on still water. Whatever Morag sensed, whatever stirred her loneliness, sharpened her nights, and shadowed her final errands, it had been more than melancholy. It had been a forewarning.
Chapter 5. Old Grudges in Quiet Places. Hamish found Angus MacRae in the lower fields, guiding a pair of slow-moving sheep-dogs around a cluster of wandering ewes. The man's broad shoulders rose and fell with steady breaths, though his movements carried a faint stiffness, as if he were bracing for questions he hoped wouldn't come. When he saw Hamish approaching, he lifted a hand in greeting, but didn't stop working until the dogs had the flock neatly gathered. "A mornin', Constable," Angus said, wiping his palms on his trousers. "I suppose this isn't a social call." "Not quite," Hamish replied gently. "I'd like to ask a few things about Morag. I hear the two of you had the odd disagreement." "Aye, well, folk talk. We had differences now and then, but nothing worth fussin' over." He glanced away toward the hills, as though the landscape could speak on his behalf. "Just the usual back and forth about remedies and what's best for the animals." Hamish watched him closely. The man's voice was calm, but his weight shifted from one foot to the other in a slow, restless rhythm. The sheep-dogs sat nearby, ears flicking at midges, their patience mirroring the steady hum of the fields. "From what I've heard," Hamish said, keeping his tone light, "you didn't always see eye to eye." Angus shrugged, though the gesture was tighter than it should have been. "Morag had her ways, old ways. Herbs and teas and whispered cures passed down through her family. I respect all that, but I'm a man who trusts what he can measure. We argued a bit, sure, but it was small stuff, nothing serious." Hamish let the silence stretch a moment. "Did you speak with her recently?" That question brought a faint shift in Angus's expression, just a flicker, but enough to reveal something unsettled beneath the surface. "Not for a couple of weeks, maybe longer. She'd been keeping to herself from what I heard. Your wife consulted her. You knew about that?" The farmer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Aye, eventually." He bent to pick up a loose strand of twine, twirling it between his fingers before pocketing it. "Morag meant well, always did, but sometimes she stepped into matters best kept within a family." Hamish gave a small nod. "Your wife said Morag's advice helped." "Oh, it did," Angus admitted. "She felt steadier after only a few days. I even thanked Morag the next time I saw her." He paused, the memory bringing a faint crease to his brow. "But she looked at me in a way I didn't quite understand, as if she wanted to say something more, or wished I'd said something else." "Did she seem troubled?" Hamish asked. "Aye," Angus murmured. "Not frightened, just distant, like her thoughts were miles away." He shifted again, boots pressing into soft earth. "I thought she might have taken on more than she could manage. There were rumors she'd been preparing a new mixture for someone, something complicated, but Morag never spoke of her work unless she wished to." Hamish studied the man, his guarded posture, his cautious phrasing, the unspoken thread of regret woven through every word. "Angus," Hamish said quietly, "is there anything you've held back, even something small?" The farmer shook his head, but his eyes lingered on the horizon rather than meeting Hamish's. "Nothing more than that. Just old disagreements and a bit of pride. Nothing worth troubling her final days." Yet the faint tremor in his voice told Hamish there was more beneath the soil. Old frustrations, settled like stones, never fully buried, waiting to be turned over by a careful hand.
Chapter 6. The Missing Ingredient. Hamish made his way along the narrow lane leading to the apothecary's shop, the soft crunch of gravel under his boots steady and unhurried. A thin veil of mist drifted across the rooftops, stirring gently as he passed, as though reluctant to release whatever quiet secrets it held. In his pocket, wrapped carefully in a linen handkerchief, lay the small portion of Morag's unfinished mixture, its faint earthy scent curling upward each time he adjusted his coat. The apothecary, Mr. Calder, looked up from polishing a row of glass bottles when Hamish stepped inside. The shop carried the warm scent of lavender, and something sharper beneath it, something metallic and slightly bare. Shelves were lined with herbs, powders, ointments, and labeled jars bearing names in Mr. Calder's delicate handwriting. "Constable Macbeth," he greeted, offering a small nod. "You're early for the week. I thought you only came by when the midges got the better of you." Hamish offered a faint smile. "For once, I'm not here on my own account." He reached into his pocket and set the carefully wrapped bundle on the counter. "I was hoping you could spare a moment to look at something." Mr. Calder wiped his hands and unfolded the linen. He brought the mixture close to his nose, inhaled, and studied its texture with a practiced eye. As he turned the small mound with the tip of a brass scoop, his brow furrowed. "Where did you get this?" "Morag's cottage," Hamish replied softly. "It was left on her work table." The apothecary set the scoop down, his expression shifting into a thoughtful heaviness. "This is mostly benign. Chamomile, crushed rowan bark, a touch of valerian root. But it's missing something. There's an intended balance here that hasn't been completed." "That's what I suspected," Hamish said. "Can you tell which herb it lacks?" The apothecary stepped to the back shelf and retrieved an old reference booklet, its pages curled from years of steam and sunlight. He flipped through them with steady fingers. "There are only a few combinations she'd have used in this way. A calming draught, perhaps, or something meant to soothe a troubled mind. But there's a gap in the blend, one she wouldn't have overlooked, not unless she was interrupted." Hamish watched the man's eyes settle on a particular entry. Mr. Calder's voice lowered slightly. "She avoided this herb after the incident with her sister. Everyone knew it. She swore she would never handle it again." He closed the booklet with a gentle but decisive motion. "It's called foxglove's breath. Only the dried edges of the petals are used. Mildly dangerous in unskilled hands. Perfectly safe in the right measure. But it can intensify certain effects, steady the heartbeat, or slow it, depending on the dose." "Was Morag ever in the habit of using it casually?" "Never," Mr. Calder answered, without hesitation. "After what happened years ago, she kept it locked away. I doubt she even touched the jar." Hamish absorbed that quietly. The jar was missing from her shelf. The apothecary paused. Missing? There was an empty ring of dust where it should have sat, no sign of where it went. Mr. Calder frowned, tracing a slow path across the counter with his fingertips. If she wasn't the one to take it, then someone else may have known its value, or perhaps someone persuaded her to use it again. Hamish felt the faint stir of a pattern settling into place, not yet clear, but no longer shapeless. Could someone have taken the jar without her noticing? It's possible, but unlikely. Morag was careful. Even on her busiest days she noticed every jar, every scrap, every leaf out of place. Unless, Hamish murmured, the person who took it was someone she trusted. A silence followed, soft and weighted. The apothecary folded the linen closed and handed it back with a slow shake of his head. Whatever she was preparing, she didn't finish it. And without that final herb, it would have been incomplete, useless even. Hamish tucked the bundle away once more. "Thank you, Mr. Calder. You've helped more than you know." As he stepped back into the mist-laden afternoon, the quiet lane seemed different, narrower somehow, and edged with an awareness just out of reach. Someone needed that missing herb, someone had taken it, and someone knew exactly what Morag had promised never to touch again.
Rain had a way of softening Lochdubh into something half-remembered and half-imagined. The hills blurred into watercolor humps, and the air smelled of peat, wet stone, and distant seaweed. As Hamish walked toward the lower end of the village, the cobbles glistened like dark glass, each footstep pressing a small echo into the quiet. It was the sort of weather that blurred memories, yet it could also preserve them, like unusual shapes trapped in amber. He had come to see Fergus MacLeod, the caretaker of the old kirk. Fergus was a man who moved slowly and spoke even slower, but he had that odd, unshakable habit of noticing things no one else bothered with. Hamish found him beneath the kirk's awning, mending a frayed rope while the rain drummed a soft, steady rhythm on the roof. "Evening, Fergus," Hamish greeted, lifting a hand. "Ah, Constable, you're looking for something." "Aye, and maybe you saw it." I stood beside him, letting the overhang shield him from the drizzle. "You were on watch here the night before Morag passed." "Was. Not much to watch these days but puddles and stray sheep." Hamish waited. With Fergus, silence was usually the best nudge. Eventually the older man sighed. "There was someone near her cottage. Late. Close to midnight, I'd say." Hamish felt the first spark of attention lift inside him. "Someone?" "Aye, a figure. Walking quick. Hood up. Rain made it hard to see their height, build, anything useful." Fergus's mouth tugged sideways. "Thought maybe it was Morag herself heading out to gather something. But the walk was different. Purposeful." "Purposeful how?" "Like they kent exactly where they were going. No hesitation." Hamish pictured the cottage, isolated enough to be private, yet not so remote that a determined soul couldn't slip there unseen. He imagined the rain thick and silver, distorting shapes and muting footsteps. "Did they knock?" he asked. "No, they went straight in. Door opened right up." That made Hamish pause. "Opened without Morag greeting them?" Fergus frowned. "Couldn't say. Maybe she was waiting. Lights were on." He scratched his chin with a rope-burned hand. "But I remember thinking the figure didn't linger. Not a pause. Not a glance back." Hamish filed that away. Familiarity, comfort, or perhaps entitlement. He thanked Fergus and crossed the slower end of the village toward the cottage of Ina Ferguson, who was known not for noticing things, but for hearing them, mostly by accident, but she always remembered the details afterward. Ina lived 2 doors up from Morag's lane, and her small window overlooked the path. When Hamish knocked, Ina opened the door with a startled flutter, clutching a teacup in both hands. "Constable, I haven't done anything, have I?" "Not unless you've taken up midnight strolls in this weather." Hamish offered a disarming smile. "Just need to ask about the night before Morag passed." "Oh, that poor woman. Come in, come in. I've a kettle on." Hamish stepped inside. Ina's sitting room smelled faintly of lavender and damped wool. He remained standing. They'd only end up in a long chat otherwise. "Did you hear anything that night?" he asked gently. Nod, eyes widening. "Voices. Quiet ones. I couldn't tell who. The rain muffled them something terrible, but I remember thinking it wasn't Morag talking to herself. There was a tone, conversational and low. You're sure there were 2 voices?" "Aye. One was hers, thin, tired. The other could have been a man, could have been a woman. Hard to tell when the rain's pounding like a drummer at Hogmanay." She bit her lip, but there was a tremble to it. Not fear, more like urgency. Urgency again. A thread connecting Fergus's sighting to Ina's overheard fragments. "Did you hear any argument?" he asked. "Nay, not that. More like persuasion." Ina's brows knitted, like someone was asking her for something, gentle-like, or trying to convince her of a thing she didn't want to agree to. Hamish let the silence settle, absorbing every detail. A visitor who entered without hesitation. Morag speaking softly to someone familiar enough to receive her past dinner time. No harsh voices, no shouts, just quiet requests in the rain. As Hamish stepped back outside, the air still damp and metallic, Hamish felt the subtle shift of the investigation. Whoever visited Morag that night mattered deeply. They had come deliberately, purposefully, and they had left without announcing themselves. A a shadow in the rain, but one the village knew well enough to open a door for.
Chapter 7. When the Village Sleeps. Sleep came to Hamish like a reluctant guest these days, hovering at the threshold, then turning away the moment he looked directly at it. Tonight was no different. After tossing beneath the heavy wool blanket for a full hour, listening to the slow creak of the cottage roof in the wind, he surrendered and rose. The night outside greeted him with a cool, familiar hush. A scattering of clouds drifted lazily across the sky, drifting past the moon like wool pulled across a lantern. The village lay still, chimneys dark, windows dim, doors latched. Even the usual nighttime sounds had softened. The distant bleat of a restless sheep, the whisper of reeds near the river, the faint, uneven drip from a gutter overflowing somewhere along the lane. Hamish walked without hurry, letting the atmosphere fold around him. The cobbles were damp beneath his boots, gleaming faintly under the spill of silver moonlight. His breath formed small ghosts in the air. Somewhere far off, an owl gave a low, single-note call, as if confirming that the entire world had quieted for him. His thoughts moved just as slowly. The missing herb jar. The idea clung to him more persistently than any of the other clues. If Morag truly had intended to use that rare ingredient, the one she had avoided for years after the old incident, then something extraordinary must have driven her to it. Something urgent enough to make her open an old wound. Yet nothing he'd found in her cottage suggested she feared for herself. Her door hadn't been bolted. Her belongings weren't hidden or disturbed. There were no signs of frantic preparation. She hadn't been bracing for danger. She was preparing to help. Hamish stopped near the baker's shop, looking at its shuttered windows. Mrs. Brannan had been tense during their conversation earlier that day, too quick to insist she had heard nothing unusual. Folks in Lochdubh aren't always honest when frightened, but they also aren't skilled liars. Fear make their edges show. The more Hamish replayed the day's talks, the more he noticed small hesitations he had overlooked in daylight. Those wary glances, that tightness in their jaws. Why had the villagers retreated into themselves? Was it Morag's death that frightened them, or the thought of who might have visited her before it? His boots carried him onward, down the narrow path between the last row of cottages and the dark stretch of fields. The loch came into view then, quiet as a sleeping animal, its surface smooth where shadows rested and rippled where gentle wind brushed it. Moonlight shimmered across the water in a silver path, warm and cold at the same time. Hamish stood at the shore, hands tucked in his coat pockets. The scent of wet earth and heather drifted toward him. The mountains across the water formed quiet silhouettes, like old guardians keeping watch. He let his mind place each piece where it seemed to fit. Morag had been expecting someone. The lamp lit late, the kettle set out. Her herb shelf partially depleted. If the missing jar wasn't removed by her, then whoever arrived that night knew exactly what they needed. Fergus's sighting made more sense now, a figure comfortable enough to enter without knocking. Not a stranger then, someone trusted, or once trusted. Ina heard voices, not raised, not strained. Quiet persuasion, a kind of plea. Hamish felt a subtle tightening behind his ribs as a thought surfaced, slow and sure. Morag had a weakness for lost causes. A lifetime of tending to villagers who came to her with ailments no doctor could quite sort out. A stubborn refusal to ignore someone in need, even when that need dragged up difficult memories. He pictured Morag at her kitchen table, listening to the visitor with that soft, attentive gaze she carried, considering the rare, risky herb not for herself, but for them, choosing, even in the late hours, to try and help. The realization settled with the steadiness of a stone sinking into deep water. Whoever came, Hamish murmured to the loch, they weren't there to harm her. Not at first. The wind brushed his cheek. Cool, gentle, almost like agreement. Hamish drew a long breath, letting the crisp air clear away the last remnants of sleep. When he turned back toward the village, the moonlit path seemed to shine a little differently, as though marking the way forward. The truth wasn't complete yet, but it had shifted, aligning itself with something quieter, more human. Morag MacLean hadn't been hiding. She had been waiting, and trying once again to help someone who had come seeking her, in the rain. Hamish had just settled back inside his cottage, boots drying near the hearth, and a lamp burning low on the table, when the knock came. It was a timid sound, 3 soft taps, followed by a hurried shuffle, as though the visitor already regretted arriving. Hamish straightened, a familiar prickle of instinct moving through him. He opened the door to find Callum Fraser standing in the dim glow of the doorstep lantern, shoulders hunched, cap squeezed tight between his hands. Callum was not the sort to knock on anyone's door after nightfall. He lived cautiously within his routines, like a man afraid to wake old ghosts. "Constable," Callum murmured, voice thin. I need a word, if you'll have it." Hamish stepped aside at once. "Aye, come in." Callum crossed the threshold like a man entering a chapel, hat twisting nervously in his fingers. Hamish gestured to the chair opposite him, but Callum only hovered near it before lowering himself slowly, as though the wood would protest. For a long moment he said nothing. The lamp crackled softly. A log in the hearth sighed. Hamish waited. Finally, Callum cleared his throat. "It's Morag," he whispered, eyes fixed on the knuckles of his hands. "I've been thinking on it since you spoke with me earlier, and I realized I can't keep quiet any more." Hamish leaned forward, careful not to push. "Take your time." Callum's breath shuddered out, each word trembling. "I saw her that night. Not just her. I saw who came to her door." Hamish's pulse tightened, though his voice didn't. "You didn't mention that before." "Because I was afraid," Callum confessed, each word trembling. "Afraid of what it meant. Afraid of stirring the past again." He swallowed hard. "You remember the incident, years back, with the herbs she misjudged, how she nearly lost her place in the village?" Hamish nodded. He hadn't lived in Lochdubh then, but he knew the story. A dangerous miscalculation, a sickened patient, Morag's remorse so profound it had altered the course of her work. She swore she'd never touch that mix again, not after what happened, and she swore she'd keep clear of the person who pushed her toward using it in the first place. Hamish felt the room narrow around the words. "You're saying that person came back?" Callum raised his eyes for the first time. They shone in the lamplight, bright with fear and guilt. "His nephew, Aidan." The name settled heavily between them. Hamish knew it only from fragments, passing mentions, quickly swallowed, a family disagreement, a falling out marked by disappointment in distance. The villagers rarely spoke of him, as though his absence was easier than his memory. Callum continued, voice low and uneven. "I shouldn't have been out that late, but I'd been helping my brother repair a cart. It was near dark when I passed Morag's path, and I saw him, Aidan, standing at her door. She opened it for him without hesitation, as if she'd been expecting him, or dreading him." He rubbed his hands over his face. "I didn't stay. I didn't want to hear their argument, if they had one, but I saw her look, sad, resolved, like she already knew what she'd do, like she'd forgiven him before he even asked." Hamish felt understanding coil slowly through him, steady and cold. "And you're saying it was him?" he asked softly. Callum nodded. "I'd know the lad anywhere. He carries his father's shoulders and Morag's eyes, and if he'd come asking for help, well, Morag wouldn't have turned him away, not even after everything." The lamp flickered as if startled. Callum's next words came in a whisper, barely above breath. "Constable, whatever happened in that cottage, it wasn't a stranger. It was family, and Morag broke her promise because she loved him." He lowered his gaze again, shame folding his thin shoulders. "I should have told you sooner, but I feared the trouble it'd bring." Hamish placed a steady hand on the table between them. "You've done right by coming now." Callum exhaled shakily, relief and sorrow mingling in the sound. A piece had fallen into place, quiet, inevitable, and heavy. Not the whole truth, but the heart of it was now beating in the open. Morag's last hours had been shaped by a return from the past and by a promise broken out of love.
Chapter 8.
the gentle unraveling. Morning crept over Lochdubh not with fanfare, but with a soft silver quiet, as though the mist itself wished to move gently around the village. Hamish walked the narrow path toward Morag's cottage once more, the cool air carrying the faint scent of heather and distant peat smoke. After the long night of confessions and quiet revelations, the world felt subdued, as if it too waited for understanding. The cottage door, still slightly ajar just as he had first found it, swayed faintly in the morning breeze. Hamish paused there, taking in the way the early light softened everything it touched, the stones of the wall, the herbs along the window, the worn handle of the door. Nothing about the place felt fearful. If anything, it felt sorrowfully peaceful, as though the cottage itself wished to comfort the truth now rising to the surface. Inside, nothing had changed. The tidy room, the ordered shelves, the missing herb jar, the unfinished mixture on the table, it was all exactly as he had left it. But with Callum's confession still fresh in his mind, each detail seemed to shift, aligning into a clearer, more compassionate picture. He stepped toward the small table and leaned over the bowl of half-prepared herbs. The apothecary's words echoed gently, rare, delicate, dangerous if misused. Morag had known that all too well. She had sworn never to use the mixture again, not after the past incident that had weighed on her heart for years, and yet she had begun preparing it, not out of ambition, not out of fear, but because someone she loved, someone she had once failed, had come seeking her help. He pictured Aidan, worn by illness or worry, turning up at her doorstep in the rain, Morag greeting him with that quiet steadiness she offered so freely, letting him in without hesitation, a family bond, frayed but never severed, a hope that perhaps this time she could set things right. Hamish rested his hand on the back of the chair by the table, noticing again how it sat slightly off-center, not quite aligned with the floor pattern. A detail that had nagged him before now seemed painfully human. A chair moved quickly, perhaps in distress or urgency. He knelt by the shelf where the missing herb jar had once sat, the faint ring of dust still outlining its absence. Aidan must have taken it, perhaps while Morag's attention was elsewhere. Perhaps she had tried to stop him. Perhaps she had refused to go further with the mixture, remembering the shadow of the past incident. He rose slowly, letting the story settle. Morag had likely prepared the harmless parts of the mixture, intending to calm or soothe, but refusing the final dangerous step. Aidan, frightened and desperate, must have attempted to finish the preparation alone. The inhalation of powdered herbs, mishandled, unbalanced, could have been enough to cause sudden collapse. Morag, stepping toward him, or toward the mixture, would have breathed it in too. Not a struggle, not a betrayal, but a tragic accident born of love and fear and the longing to help. Hamish felt a deep, gentle ache settle in his chest. Morag's final moments had not been filled with suspicion or conflict. They'd been filled with compassion, with the instinct to heal someone she cared for, even at the risk of breaking an old promise. He moved to the window, looking out at the morning mist rolling softly across the fields. It was a tender sight, quiet, blurred, and forgiving, the kind of dawn that seemed to wrap the village in a shawl of understanding. Morag, he mumbled under his breath, you were doing what you always did, helping, comforting, giving. The truth, now fully unfurled, felt neither sharp nor relieving, but gently sad, like a story ending in the only way it could. A life marked by kindness had closed on an act of the same nature. Hamish stepped outside, letting the mist settle lightly on his coat. The village was awakening slowly, unaware that its lingering questions had finally found their answers. He breathed in the cool air and exhaled softly. The unraveling was complete, quiet, compassionate, and true.
The village awoke to a softer light than usual, the kind that seemed to smooth the edges of the world
and disperse whatever shadows lingered from the night before. Hamish walked steadily along the quiet road toward the small cottage where Aidan was now resting under the supervision of the district nurse. The man had been exhausted, shaken more by guilt than by illness, and Hamish had made certain he would receive the care and guidance he needed. It was clear Aidan had never intended harm. His mistake had been born of desperation and long-held remorse, a mixture as potent as any herb Morag once handled. Hamish paused near the doorway, listening to the low murmur of the nurse moving inside. The calmness in her voice told him everything was under control. Aidan would recover, and the tragedy need not ripple further through the village. There was comfort in that knowledge, a sense of rightness settling gently over the situation. Leaving the cottage behind, Hamish stepped onto the village path again, where morning sunlight filtered through a thin layer of cloud. It washed over the rooftops, lending the stone walls a warm hue that softened the earlier gloom. Lochdubh seemed to breathe easier now that the truth had settled. Rumors slowed, glances steadied, and the villagers moved about with a quiet, respectful understanding. They mourned Morag, but the fear and uncertainty that had clouded her death no longer weighed on them. As Hamish strolled past the bakery, Mrs. McLean lifted a hand in greeting. Her smile was small but sincere, the kind that suggested gratitude without needing words. A few villagers lingering outside the shop straightened slightly when they saw him, offering nods that carried the gentle rhythm of renewed trust. No one approached him for explanations. The village preferred peace over details, so long as its sense of safety remained intact. Further along, the loch shimmered beneath the lifting mist, its surface calm and pale as brushed silver. Hamish paused there for a moment, letting the tranquility settle. The water had a way of restoring perspective, smoothing the mind in the same steady manner it smoothed its reflections. The reeds at the edge swayed lightly in a breeze that barely carried weight. Even the gulls overhead seemed slower this morning, drifting rather than circling. Everything, he thought, was finding its balance again. Walking on, he made his way toward Morag's cottage one final time. The path felt familiar now, quiet underfoot, lined with tufts of grass that glistened from the night's dew. The door stood closed, as it should have been from the start, resting peacefully against its frame. In the soft light, the cottage looked like any other, humble, weathered, and folded naturally into the hillside. Only the silence hinted at the absence felt by the village. Hamish stepped into the garden instead of going inside. Morag's herbs still grew in tidy clusters, their leaves stirring faintly. Lavender, mint, and yarrow whispered in the breeze, releasing scents that drifted through the air as gently as memories. He touched a sprig of rosemary, thinking of the countless villagers whose ailments Morag had tended with these plants. Small fevers soothed, headaches eased, and worries calmed by her patient presence. Her work lingered here, quiet and steadfast. Hamish stood for a moment longer, letting the calm settle through him. He felt no lingering tension, no puzzles left unsorted, only a deep, slow gratitude for the way the truth had unveiled itself, without bitterness, without harshness. Morag's final act had been one of care, and the village would remember her for that, not for the manner of her passing. When he turned to leave, the sunlight had grown warmer, casting long, gentle beams across the footpath. Lochdubh was stirring back into its familiar rhythm, steady, thoughtful, and touched always by the surrounding hills. Hamish walked back toward the village center, feeling the peace settle behind him like a closing chapter. Balance, at last, had returned to Lochdubh.